Hello everybody and welcome back. We are at episode number 8 on how to build your own rock buggy. Today we're going to talk about the back end of the buggy. We're going to talk about the fuel tank, the exhaust and the mufflers, as well as the suspension links, so the lower and upper links, as well as the mounts for the suspension on the axle and the frame. So from last episode we finished talking about the B pillar, the A pillar of the buggy, and how to connect a bunch of different tubes together. So today we're going to start off by talking about the back end. So for the back end of the buggy, I basically started off by building the fuel tank. So the fuel tank was built out of 1/8 or 1/25 thousandths of an inch wall, aluminum. I basically built the fuel tank first. It was one of the first items that I built for the buggy. I do have a video on my channel for how to build your own fuel tank, so I'll put a link for it at the end of the video here. So basically what I did is I made sure I built a jig or a mount or anything just to kind of hold your fuel tank level at the level that you want it to be. You know that the chassis and the axles are fairly level and straight, so you can just position your fuel tank in the center of the chassis exactly where you want it. You might notice here that one of the criteria for positioning my fuel tank was I wanted to make sure that the heat from the fans, from the engine coolant fans, are actually blowing hot air underneath the fuel tank and not on the fuel tank itself. So this is important because you don't want to heat up the fuel. It can cause some issues with the engine running properly. So after I positioned the fuel tank, the fuel tank was actually built by me. I cut it up in different pieces of aluminum, and then I tack welded it from the inside using my MIG spool gun. And then after it was done, I gave it to my friend who was a much better TIG welder than me. And because this is a much critical project for TIG welding, I wanted him to TIG weld it. He's got more experience. So just in order to make sure that it doesn't leak. And at the same time, he also built a whole bunch of pucks. These are kind of mounting tabs. These are aluminum mounting tabs that go on the fuel tank. And he welded them also all in place. So inside this fuel tank, even though it is built of 0.125 thousandths of an inch, it has a lot of bracing and supports inside in order to prevent fuel sloshing around from causing excessive stress on the weld joints for this particular fuel tank. I've had several different fuel tanks in the past. I've had the standard RCI fuel tanks, which I think they're built out of 0.1 of a thousandth of an inch thickness, and I've also had custom fuel tank built with even 1/4 inch thick aluminum. So for the RCI fuel tanks, because they're only supported at the bottom with four different mounts, there's no bracing inside them, and they usually hold 20-30 gallons of fuel. So a lot of fuel, that fuel sloshing around off-roading caused my RCI fuel tanks to leak at the seams. And so I decided to weld them up. So I welded them up and tried it again, and a couple weeks later they were still leaking again. So I decided at that time to build 1/4 inch wall fuel tank, and I think that was a little bit excessive. It was a little bit heavier, but it was very strong, so it never leaked. But it was bulky too, and it had like 35 gallons of fuel, which was a lot. That was for the Bronco buggy. For this buggy, I wanted to build a different and unique fuel cell. You can see this one is not a standard fuel cell. It has a whole bunch of different angles. It actually took me a long time to figure out the geometry to build it properly. I cut off all the aluminum pieces using plasma, and basically the fittings for it. I used AN fittings, and the filler cap, I bought those from Summit Racing, and they were fairly cheap. And so I'm basically running -8 fuel lines to my engine. I mean, these are larger than normal, but remember I have a larger than normal displacement engine, so that is why I had to run big fuel lines. So once the fuel tank is in place and I'm happy with its position, I pretty much just start, bending tubes around the fuel tank. So I wanted to make sure that the back end or the tubes on the back of the buggy are as close as possible to the fuel tank to make it look like they match very well together. And I think I was pretty successful at that. I'm pretty happy with the way it turned out in the back. So you can see, start building them one tube at a time, and basically just connect all the tubes together once I'm done. So one of the considerations I had to think about when I was building the back end of the buggy is I wanted to make sure that I could get the fuel tank out from the top of the buggy. There's an opening in the back end, and I also wanted to make sure that I can get the radiator out as well. So I was pretty happy. I mean, tolerances are very, very small, but I'm able to get either the radiator or the fuel tank out of the back of the buggy while keeping the other components in place. And I also put my my oil cooler for the transmission all the way to the back. I wanted to do that because I wanted to put it in a place where it gets some airflow, and it's not a place that is very hot. So it's blowing air from in front of the fuel tank. There's about an inch or an inch and a half space between the cooler and the back of the fuel tank. So, and I also had to make sure that the radiator, the coolant lines for the radiator flow freely, and there's enough room where the tubes are. So once that is done, I obviously checked. I had to make sure that the fuel tank as well as the radiator, I can get them out of the buggy. So I had to make sure that this happens, and this is the picture where I took when I tested them, and I was happy. Yes, they come out from the top. I have an extra piece of tube that I put at the top of the back of the buggy, and I just have to remove this piece of tube, and then I can get everything out, and then I can put it back in. This kind of adds extra strength. Honestly, I don't really think it's needed in terms of strength, but it's an extra kind of protection over the fuel tank, just in case I roll over and the rock hits the fuel tank. Obviously going to burst. So I wanted to give it a little bit extra protection. And I also decided to build a kind of a mount for a clevis in the back of the buggy to try to instead of using a tow strap wrapped around the tube, I can basically just use a clevis, which turned out to be quite useful. So once everything's I'm happy with the radiator and the fuel tank, I put them back in the back of the buggy. So I did that because when you're adding different components to the chassis, you have to make sure that you fit everything in place. So you cannot remove some components and then put other components in their place, because they might not all fit in the same spot, especially if you're trying to maximize real estate inside the buggy. So you have to make sure that you build you add components. Basically, the logical way is to start with the larger items first and then go to the smaller items later. So in terms of protection from welding spatter, what I do is or sparks. What I do is I have 3 different welding blankets, and I pretty much wrap them around the seats, anything that is sensitive to welding sparks and spatter and whatever. You could just protect them from that using welding blankets. It's all done. The back end is all done. Quite happy with it. Now it's time for me to move to the suspension. So I had to think about what kind of material I am going to use for the lower links. So for the lower links, I ended up using a 1/4 inch wall, 2-inch outer diameter DOM tubes, and with aluminum slug pretty much slid inside the whole length of the link. I thought long and hard about what I'm going to do, and there were basically 3 options. The first option is using all aluminum tube, lower links and upper links, obviously. And typically I would want for the weight of my buggy, I would want probably 2¼ inch 70-75 aluminum links. But honestly, I thought they were quite expensive, and 70-75 is somewhat of an exotic material where I live, so they weren't readily available. The other possibility was to use DOM tubing, either 1/4 inch thick, 3/8, or even 1/2. And I pretty much had friends with all these kind of sizes of tubing, and pretty much all of them had bent them, and I've bent my old links as well all the time. So that is why I decided to go with option number 3, which is slide the aluminum slug inside the DOM tubing. So this is not as simple as it looks in the picture. I thought they would fit really nicely. You know, I thought, yeah, you know, the DOM is good tolerances. It must be, if it's 2-inch outer diameter, 1/4 inch wall, it must be exactly 1½ inches inside. So all I have to do is buy 1½ inch solid aluminum tube, and then I will just slide right in. That did not happen. So basically, I'm not sure why, but the aluminum tube was actually slightly larger than 1.5 inches. So I had to get it machined, probably about 10 thou, removed off of it, and then even at that, I had to heat up the steel DOM tube, and I put my the aluminum tube. I put it outside. That was during the winter. It was pretty cold outside, and then I was able to slide them in fairly easily. After that is done, I'm ready to weld the bungs for the suspension. These are threaded bungs for the hind joints, and I make sure that I chamfer the DOM tube, and I clean it all out so I can see clean metal only. You could either, if you're good at TIG welding, you could do that with a TIG or with a MIG if it's good enough, and make sure that you put a lot of heat in it. And make sure you have to put just enough heat not to damage the threads inside. Obviously, I think you should know that. But you have to make sure also that this is one of the most critical welds that you're gonna do on your buggy, because you know the amount of forces that this weld's gonna take are tremendous. So you have to kind of take extra care doing this type of welding here. And once again, once I was done, I also started mocking up the length. So for mocking the length of the lower and upper control arms, I pretty much just install the hind joints and the tube bung in place, and then after that, I just measure how much tube I want, and then tack weld the tube, put it back in place, make sure everything's okay, and then I started building the mounts. So the frame mounts for the upper and the lower links. In this picture here, you're seeing the lower link mount. It must be very, very, very strong. So that frame here, you see, I did a lot of welding. I added a whole bunch of different gussets on it, and basically these gussets are like 3/8, and I also have like 3/16 underneath, and a whole bunch of different steel, and I have 2 tubes running to the top, and you know, you might think this is overkill. It was not. I actually 2 years after I finished doing this, I was just checking the welds, because I routinely kind of look underneath the body to see if there's any cracks in the frame or in the welds, and I did find one crack right where this mount, the 3/8 mount, connects to the tube right behind it. So I added another gusset, and now it's been fine since. But just to tell you that the link mounts must be very, very strong, because you cannot imagine the amount of forces that go through them. So you have to be very careful with that. And then obviously when you're building your suspension, you have to remember that you have to cycle the suspension and the tires as well. So you have to make sure that everything clears. By experience, I know what clears and what doesn't clear, and I also did some testing as well to make sure that everything clears. I built these are the upper link towers on the axle. I built them all myself. It's amazing when you have a plasma cutter. You can cut through 3/8 steel like butter. This is really helpful, and it saves you money. Because otherwise you would have to buy these yourself. and they cost a lot of money too. So you're saving money by building them yourself. So the upper links were also all done, and so the suspension was pretty much all done. You can see here in this picture here that in the boat side area there's a leftover space. So this leftover space here is for the exhaust. So the exhaust is just going to flow through it, and I found this to be the best spot to have the exhaust. It's far away from everything. It's not going to heat up the engine, transmission, or the passengers. It's towards the outside. This worked out really awesome for me. And you have to also remember that you're building at full compression, right? So this is the back end complete at full compression. Huge step here in the buggy process. So pretty much I could just put tires on it and just roll it out of the shop if I want to. I can pretty much take the weight out of the chassis table, so I can just get it out of the way. And it's pretty much I can just put jack stands if I want to here. I haven't built the bump stops yet, but once you build the bump stops, then you can just remove the jack stands from underneath the belly of the buggy. And obviously you have to remember that you still have the shocks to mount. Something important as well, you need to have protection for the oil pan for the engine. So the oil pan for the engine is quite important. I've had mine dent several times on rocks, even though you would think that's high enough, rocks are not going to reach it, but they do reach it. So you have to be careful, especially if you have a custom oil pan like the one that I have here. So it costs a lot of money, so I didn't want to damage it. Just a few extra tubes doesn't hurt. Here it is. The bumps are all complete now, so I can pretty much remove the, if I want to, I can remove the jack stands from underneath the buggy. I left them anyway, just so I finished putting the shocks. Okay, and then I finished the both sides. The both sides are all complete here. All right, so final step for the suspension is basically just to mount the coil overs. So for the coil overs, I pretty much, because each coil over is going to have two different springs, so what I do is I just remove one of the springs, and then I just mount only one spring, and you have to remove all the nitrogen out of the shocks in order to be able to compress them. Otherwise, they won't compress. But you want to compress them, and you want to leave, like I leave approximately between 1/2 inch to 1 inch shaft showing. This is kind of an extra insurance just in case. And you pretty much just build some also sturdy mounts for the upper and lower eyelets for the coil overs. So for the exhaust, I decided to build my own headers. You don't have to do that, but don't be scared. Building headers is not that complicated. It might seem like it's overwhelming, but it is not. And it's much cheaper, and you can design them however you want instead of designing your chassis according to some other people's headers or manifolds. So I basically bought a header building kit, if you want, from Summit Racing. And this kit, it's fairly cheap for what it is. I ended up with a whole bunch of different leftover tubes. So what this kit has, it has the collectors and a different mandrel bent exhaust tube. And you pretty much start putting them together on the chassis. I had a flange already built for my engine, and I built some, we call them kind of stubbies or stub, the little pieces of tube coming out of the exhaust manifold for the engine. And these you have to kind of form them to fit in the shape of the flange for the header. And then there's some massaging to be done for these tube in order to fit them. And once again, this depends on your type of engine. But basically, I was ready here to start building my my headers. So to build the headers, you have to start by positioning the collector first. So the collector is one of the first pieces that you have to position. And after the collector is positioned in place, this is when you start adding tubes from the stubby headers that you have already on the flange and go straight into the collector. So basically you have to imagine, you look at it and you have to imagine what is the best way for me to flow the tubes. And you see, okay, well, cylinder number 1 is much better for it to go to the back, cylinder number 2 is to the front. So you come up with some sort of a design just looking at it. What is the easiest way for the tubes to flow? And you just basically just stick the tube in the collector. I mean, you don't weld the tube to the collector yet. You can weld the tubes, tack weld the tubes together, but not to the collector yet. Once all the tubes are positioned in place and you're happy with them, you can take off the collector and take off the flange from the engine and pretty much weld all the every single header tube, and then after that you pretty much just kind of weld it to the collector. You know, there's several tricks here for making headers. I'm not gonna go through the details of welding headers. Maybe in the future I'll do a more specific videos on how to build the headers. Alright, so the headers are all complete. You have to remember that if you're running a fuel injected engine, you have to put a oxygen sensor bung or a place to thread the oxygen sensor in place. Pretty happy with these headers. They fit exactly, you know, where I want them. I didn't have to massage any other people's headers, and they fit exactly what I want. So, and they weren't that expensive. And then finally, you do all the other small, you know, pieces of the buggy. You know, you got the breather tanks, the rear steer, reservoir and rear steer unit if you have rear steer, and all the other smaller items. Like I have toolboxes and a whole bunch of different things that you connect. But usually you have to remember that you always do the largest items and the small first, and then the smallest items later. All right, so that's it for today. This episode is almost done now. So I hope you are learning something from what I'm telling you. I really appreciate all the likes that I'm getting on the other episodes, and this is really what's keeping me going. I'll have probably another 3 or 4 episodes. My plan is to talk about paint. I want to talk also about chassis electrical, and I think this is important. And maybe I'll do kind of a wrap up later on everything that I've learned or I would do differently about this particular chassis. So I would say probably at least another 3 episodes, and I will be done this series. So once again, please like and subscribe. I really appreciate your comments and your likes. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.